The principles of veganism have an expansive and extremely culturally rich history. Although the popularity of contemporary veganism that we know today is a relatively new phenomenon, the ways in which veganism is expressed are influenced by cultures and religions dating back thousands of years. From ancient India to Africa to Greece, the concept of non-violence towards animals and the abstinence from some or all animal products has been something humanity has explored all throughout history. Of course, it would be impossible to include every single culture and every single historically significant instance of discussions surrounding ideas pertaining to veganism, and as such, the information presented is intended to be a demonstration of some, though not all, influential moments within veganism's history. Although I attempted to organize everything chronologically, history can be messy, and you may find some overlap between different sections. Further, many of the people and religions mentioned were not fully vegan, nor even necessarily fully vegetarian. I felt it important to address this and explain that my goal was to explore the influences that the past has had on veganism today and further demonstrate how a concern for the moral consideration of other animals is neither new nor exclusively Western, and also that the conversations we have now about animal rights have always existed, even if they did not always exist between vegans. It would also be hard to document actual vegans far back enough in history, as there was not a word for such a way of living, at least not a popular one, until very recently, and anyone who is vegan would likely simply have been considered Pythagorean or vegetarian. Many of the earliest introductions to concepts resembling animal rights in veganism can be found in the doctrines and teachings of some of the world's oldest and longest-standing religions. One such religion is Hinduism. Scholars believe Hinduism was developed between 2300 and 1500 BCE in modern-day Pakistan. There is no specific founder of the religion. Rather, it is a fusion of beliefs stemming from the Indo-Aryan migrants in the indigenous Indus Valley populations. There are a number of passages in Hindu scripture that comment upon the morality of vegetarian and meat-based diets, such as, "The sins generated by violence curtail the life of the perpetrator. Therefore, even those who are anxious for their own welfare should abstain from meat eating," and "Those noble souls who practice meditation and other yogic ways, who are ever careful about all beings, who protect all animals, are the ones who are actually serious about spiritual practices." Thus, although Hinduism does not mandate its followers adhere to a vegetarian diet, many believe it is certainly seen as a spiritually preferable option. Further, Hinduism considers the principle of ahimsa, or the non-violence or abstention from killing, and because of passages such as the ones just cited, many argue that this principle applies to animals as well. Hinduism's predecessor, the historical Vedic religion, also comments upon the dietary choices of its followers. It places tight restrictions on when it is okay to slaughter animals and when to eat their meat. There are several scriptures that prohibit actions of violence directed towards domesticated animals, except in cases of ritual sacrifice. Many of those who ascribe to Hinduism point to the Mahabharata's maxim that non-violence is the highest duty and the highest teaching, as evidence that the religion prohibits violence towards animals, such as in the case of meat consumption. Further evidence of pro-vegetarianism within the Mahabharata can be seen in the fact that it states that adharma, or sin, was born when creatures started to devour one another from want of food, and that this always destroys every creature. The next stop on our journey through the history of veganism is ancient Egypt. Around the mid-1300s BCE, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten turned Egypt's traditionally polytheistic religion on its head by instituting his own monotheistic, or, according to some scholars, monolatristic religion that worshipped the light of the sun god Aten. Although it only lasted 20 years, ending with the pharaoh's death, there are some semblances of veganism to be picked out of its teachings. According to some scholars, such as Donald Mackenzie, Atenism banned the practice of animal sacrifice, as Akhenaten was a pacifist and believed that such sacrifices were sinful. Atenism was much more focused on respect for living things than other traditional approaches to ancient Egyptian religion. As for Egypt itself, many of the roots of Egyptian culture are quite vegan-friendly, with much of the traditional cuisine shaped in part by the country's indigenous Coptic Orthodox population, whose practice of fasting often means they are relying on plant-based foods. Many scholars believe that much of ancient Egypt's population relied on foods such as barley and wheat as their staples, which is theorized to be due to religious reasons, and likely also influenced by the fact that, during this time, meat was often considered a luxury. Further, the ancient Egyptians viewed many animals such as cows, rams, pigs, and geese to be sacred. Writings procured from Akhenaten's reign suggest that he believed all groups, whether human or animal, should be treated equally, as all of them are expressions of the bliss that exists as a result of life on Earth. Buddhism and Jainism were both born around the same time in India, so discussing them together feels necessary, especially seeing as there's a lot of overlap between their ideas. Both religions preach non-violence, both towards humans and animals. Jainism specifically calls for a lacto-vegetarian diet that also excludes underground vegetables, so as to prevent harming small insects and microorganisms. Honey also is prohibited under Jainism, as the collection of honey would cause harm to the bees. Strict Jains also do not consume food that has been either fermented or left out overnight, because such food would have a higher concentration of microorganisms, which Jains seek to minimize harm towards. When looking at Buddhism, the earliest surviving written accounts of the religion are the edicts written by King Ashoka. Ashoka spread Buddhism throughout Asia, and both schools of Buddhism, Theravada and Mahayana, honor him. He prohibited sacrificial killings of animals within his empire, and King Ashoka was committed to a vegetarian diet as a means of expressing nonviolence towards animals. Thus, scholars believe early Buddhism likely had a vegetarian component to it. The two aforementioned schools of Buddhism have slightly differing views on diet. According to the Mahayana view of Buddhism, for instance, the Buddha instructed his followers to not eat any type of meat, and any plant foods that may have come in contact with meat must be washed so as to ensure its purity. The Mahayanists also believe that eating meat strikes fear into other sentient beings, whom they say can smell death on those who eat meat. The Theravada view on Buddhism, however, approaches diet requirements a little differently. According to Theravadists, the Buddha refused to mandate vegetarianism in the monks' monastic code, and once he became enlightened, would accept meat if it was offered as an alms food with good intention. However, although meat consumption is permitted under the Theravada view, there are limitations. Meat should not be eaten under 3 circumstances: when it is seen, or heard, or suspected that a living being has been purposely slaughtered for the eater. Thus, if someone slaughtered the animal specifically for the Theravada Buddhists to eat, then it would not be permitted to eat them. Thiruvalluvar, or just Valluvar, was another significant figure within veganism's history. The exact years in which he lived are uncertain. Estimates range from the 4th to 1st centuries BCE, or even the 5th century CE, and he is believed to have lived in the city of Mylapore, India. Many religions have attempted to claim him, but he is thought to have either belonged to Jainism or Hinduism. What we do know about him, however, is that Valluvar was a celebrated Tamil poet and philosopher. He is best known as being the author of the Kural, which is a text consisting of 1,330 short couplets. Kamil Zvolibel, a Czech philosopher, believes the writings contained within the Kural reflect the moral teachings of Jainism, such as the ideas of a moral vegetarian diet and ahimsa. Chapter 26, for instance, is specifically dedicated to the concept of moral vegetarianism, with such passages as, "How can he be possessed of kindness, who to increase his own flesh eats the flesh of other creatures? Like the mind of him who carries a weapon, the mind of him who feasts with pleasure on the body of another animal has no regard for goodness. Not to eat flesh contributes to the continuance of life. Therefore, if a man eats flesh, hell will not open its mouth to let him escape. All creatures will join hands together and worship him who has never taken away life, nor eaten flesh." Many who lived during the time of ancient Greece and Rome were vegetarian, not due to religious reasons, but rather for many a philosophical concern regarding what justice was and who was deserving of it. This issue sparked furious debate about the rights, or to some the lack thereof, that should be afforded to animals. Already, many Greco-Romans lived as a vegetarian by default, simply by virtue of what was accessible to them. During this time, the Greeks and Romans typically turned to foods such as vegetables, fruits, and cereals to make up the majority of their diet. Many of them even grew their own food. Meat was typically something only the wealthy could afford, especially if it was good quality meat. Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher and mathematician born on the island of Samos. He studied in many different places, such as modern-day Greece, Egypt, and Iraq. He is also perhaps one of the most influential philosophers during the Greco-Roman period in terms of sparking discussions surrounding ideas related to animal rights and the concept of extending moral consideration towards non-human animals. He believed, for instance, that animals could have a soul and be reincarnated. Therefore, any single human could be reincarnated when they die as a pig who would be slaughtered for bacon, and consequently, any animal one might eat could have been a human in a previous life. This idea is referred to as metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls from one body into another after death. Pythagoras also argued that eating animals was not only unhealthy, but also caused war and prevented union with a higher form of reality. His ideas were so influential that the phrase Pythagorean diet was used to refer to what we now consider vegetarianism to be. It is worth noting, however, that abstention from meat to Pythagoras seemed to do less with a concern for animal welfare and more to do with a concern for how it would impact humans' inner psyche. Plato was an Athenian philosopher during the classical period in ancient Greece, and a noted student of the aforementioned philosopher Pythagoras. Plato seemed to echo his teacher's philosophy on meat eating, at least to some extent. It is unclear what his diet was, and his teachings assert only humans have immortal souls. However, in his Socratic dialogue, The Republic, Plato's character, Socrates, describes the ideal city as a vegetarian one, believing that meat was a luxury that led to decadence and war. Therefore, vegetarianism to Plato stems from a desire for peace and a dislike of opulent, decadent, and luxurious styles of living. One excerpt from the Republic states, "The work people will live, I suppose, on barley and wheat, baking cakes of the meal and kneading loaves of the flour. By this extension of our inquiry, we shall perhaps discover how it is that injustice takes root in our cities. If you also contemplate a city that is suffering from inflammation, whose people have departed from simplicity, they will not be satisfied, it seems, with the mode of life we have described, but must have, in addition, couches and tables and every other showy article of furniture, as well as meats and viands. We shall need swineherds for such a city, and great quantities of all kinds of cattle for those who may wish to eat them, then decline and decay." Here we can see that Plato is both describing vegetarianism as being necessary for the ideal city, and further that instances of injustice are preceded by acts of overstepping the bounds of simplicity, such as by consuming meats. Not every Greco-Roman philosopher bought into the idea of vegetarianism. Aristotle, for instance, was a Greek philosopher who studied under Plato, and like Plato, he believed that the universe was for humans and that only humans have souls that were immortal. However, he also argued that animals were irrational and that we therefore had no ethical obligation to them. Aristotle also developed what was called the Great Chain of Being, which arranged different forms of life and objects into a hierarchy, with rocks at the bottom and God at the top. Within these groups were subgroups sectioned into sub-hierarchies, which Aristotle used to express the belief that women were less valuable than men and that some humans were natural-born slaves. The line of Greco-Roman philosophers who thought critically about the morality surrounding how we treat non-human animals continued for hundreds of years, such as with Theophrastus, who believed consuming animals was immoral and a result of war, that war drove people to consuming meat out of necessity because it destroyed their crops, and also that animal sacrifices angered the gods. Ovid, who in his poem Metamorphosis asked people to abandon ritualistic animal sacrifices and abstain from eating meat. Plutarch, who adopted a vegetarian diet and wrote several essays in favor of vegetarianism, and further argued that animals were rational and deserving of consideration. In his piece entitled On the Eating of Flesh, Plutarch ponders upon how the first man could bring himself to slaughter and eat an animal, wondering, quote, how his sight could endure the blood of the slaughtered, flayed, and mangled bodies, how his smell could bear their scent, and how the very nastiness happened not to offend the taste, while it chewed the sores of others, and participated of the sap and juices of deadly wounds. Plotinus, who founded Neoplatonism and taught that all animals feel pain and pleasure, not just humans. He was a vegetarian, and it was speculated that many of those who belonged to Neoplatonism may have been vegetarian as well. And finally, Porphyry, who argued in favor of vegetarianism upon multiple grounds, including ethics. He believed eating meat encouraged violence and that animals had the ability to reason, that they were sentient, possessed wisdom, and have a sense of awareness, and further that justice should be extended towards them. In Book 2 of his On Abstinence from Animal Food, Porphyry compares killing animals to killing humans, writing, "But with respect to other animals who do not at all act unjustly and are not naturally impelled to injure us, it is certainly unjust to destroy and murder them. No otherwise than it would be to slay men who are not iniquitous. And this seems to evince that the justice between us and other animals does not arise from some of them being naturally noxious and malefic, but others not, as is also the case with respect to men." Here, Porphyry comments upon the idea that animals whom we eat are innocent and do not pose a threat to us, and that there is therefore no more reason to murder them than an innocent person. He also says that the justification of some animals posing a threat to us cannot be used to justify eating meat, since this is also true of other humans. Our journey continues as we leave the BC era and enter into the early stages of the current or Common Era. Around the year 142, Taoism, a Chinese philosophy based on the writings of Lao Tzu, in which advocated humility and religious piety, was formed. Taoism emphasizes living in harmony with the Tao, with the natural order of the universe whose character one's human intuition must discern in order to realize the potential for individual wisdom. Taoist monks ate simply, and the levels of abstinence with which they practiced in their diets varied. This could include fully plant-based eating, vegetarianism, pescatarianism, and other diets. Some Taoist orders promoted a vegetarian diet in order to minimize the harm that is caused to other sentient life. Fast forwarding a few centuries, and we run into the blind Arab philosopher, poet, and writer Al-Mari. He was born in the city of Mara, and was highly critical of religion, with some describing him as a pessimistic free thinker. He was also vegan and promoted nonviolence, sentiments which are expressed in his poem I No Longer Steal from Nature, where he writes, "You are diseased in understanding and religion. Come to me that you may hear something of sound truth. Do not unjustly eat fish the water has given up, and do not desire as food the flesh of slaughtered animals, or the white milk of mothers, who intended its pure draught for their young, not noble ladies. And do not grieve the unsuspecting birds by taking eggs, for injustice is the worst of crimes. And spare the honey which the bees get industriously from the flowers of fragrant plants, for they did not store it that it might belong to others, nor did they gather it for bounty and gifts. I wash my hands of all this, and wish that I perceived my way before my hair went gray." Al-Mari is one of the earliest known actual vegan philosophers to exist. He also supported independent and critical thought and spoke against blind faith in religion, writing, "Do not suppose the statements of the prophets to be true. They are all fabrications. Men lived comfortably till they came and spoiled life. The sacred books are only such a set of idle tales as any age could have, and indeed did, actually produce." His anti-religious views made him controversial during his lifetime, and he remains controversial even today. Although many people may recognize the name Voltaire because of his association with the French Revolution, not many people realize that he also thought deeply about our treatment of animals. It seems his views on the subject were influenced by the followers of Hinduism, whom he described as, quote, "peaceful and innocent people, equally incapable of hurting others or of defending themselves." He considered the Hindus' nonviolent approach to animals to be ideal, and considered the ways Europeans treated animals to be shameful in comparison. In his Dictionnaire philosophique, Voltaire writes, "Barbarians seize this dog, which in friendship surpasses man so prodigiously. They nail it on a table, and they dissect it alive, in order to show the mesenteric veins. You discover in it all the same organs of feeling that are in yourself. Answer me, machinist. Has nature arranged all the means of feeling in this animal so that it may not feel? Has it nerves in order to be impassible? Do not suppose this impertinent contradiction in nature." Here we can see clear evidence of Voltaire's concern with how animals are treated. He recognizes them as feeling, thinking individuals who are capable of suffering, and thus concludes that to treat them as though they are mere machines and to ignore the similarities they bear to us is barbaric. Jeremy Bentham was an English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer regarded as the founder of modern utilitarianism. Many of the ideas he proposed were progressive in nature, advocating things such as individual and economic freedoms, the separation of church and state, freedom of expression, equal rights for women, the right to divorce, and, in an unpublished essay, the decriminalization of homosexuality. He called for the abolition of slavery as well as of capital punishment and physical punishment. Bentham argued for certain animal rights on the basis of their ability to suffer, and that this was the insuperable line with which we should determine moral consideration and treatment. This was contrasted against the pre-existing view that reason was what determined moral value, a view which he criticized by pointing out that if reason alone were the way by which we judge who ought to have rights, then human infants and adults with certain forms of disabilities would be barred from those rights. This view is expressed in Bentham's An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, in which he famously wrote, "The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being?" It is worth noting, however, that he did not condemn meat consumption in cases where the animal, he believed, did not suffer, and further was fine with medical experimentation on animals, so long as the experiment, he said, quote, has a determinate object, beneficial to mankind, accompanied with a fair prospect of the accomplishment of it. In other words, he was fine with it as long as the outcome would be sufficiently beneficial for humans and we had a fair certainty it would be successful. Despite this, Bentham helped shape animal rights philosophy for years to come, and many of his principles are foundational to how veganism is viewed and discussed even today. Romanticism was an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. It emphasized ideas such as the individual, the imaginative, the personal, the emotional, and the transcendental. One of the characteristics of the Romantic period was a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature, and many of its most prominent literary figures followed a diet that abstained from meat as a means of respecting this principle. Such personalities include Mary and Percy Shelley, Alexander Pope, Lord Byron, and Joseph Ritson. Reflections of the Romantic adherence to a vegetarian diet can be seen in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in which it is stated that Frankenstein's monster was himself a vegetarian, claiming, quote, "I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment." Because of the Romantic aesthetic of compassion and communion with nature, many of its leading figures found meat consumption sacrilegious. Vegetarianism during this time also increased in popularity among people more generally, influenced by the high prices of meat, stronger feelings of humanitarianism, perhaps due to Romanticism's presence, a newfound accessibility to meat alternatives, and growing feelings of dissent directed towards consumerism and classism. Following the rise in vegetarianism, just outlined, the mid-1800s proved to be a bountiful time for the formation of vegetarian societies. One such example can be seen in the year 1847 with the formation of the very first vegetarian society, which was founded in Ramsgate, England. This marked the time where the word vegetarian officially replaced Pythagorean. The society itself boasted 265 members by the end of its first year, whose participants' ages ranged from 14 to 76. By the end of the century, it had almost 4,000 members. 3 years after the first vegetarian society's formation came the founding of the American Vegetarian Society. The society's meetings attracted many notable feminists and abolitionists, such as Susan B. Anthony, Horace Greeley, Lucy Stone, and Amelia Bloomer. In 1821, the society's founder, William Metcalfe, published a pamphlet inspired by Porphyry's on the abstinence from animal foods. Through this, he converted some of the most prominent vegetarians at the time, including William Alcott and Sylvester Graham. During the Victorian era, women were seen as the main face of vegetarianism and played a significant, though largely overlooked, role in its advocacy. When veganism was promoted in journals, it was usually accompanied with images of women, some of whom were depicted as angels. Women also partook in a lot of forms of direct action, such as cooking vegetarian meals for family and friends and organizing entertainment that promoted the cause. Many of them also edited vegetarian journals, wrote articles, lectured, and compiled cookbooks. 14 of the 26 vegetarian journals to emerge from the Victorian era were authored by women. Further, many vegetarian women also identified as feminists. Some feminists, such as Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Margaret Fuller, advocated vegetarianism in their works. The Jungle is a 1906 novel by American journalist and novelist Upton Sinclair. The novel portrays the harsh conditions and exploited lives of immigrants in the United States. The Jungle follows its main character, Jurgis Redkiss, a Lithuanian immigrant who takes a job at Brown's slaughterhouse, and outlines the struggles associated with poverty and poor working and living conditions that he and his family face. Upton Sinclair's goal with writing the novel was to, quote, expose the inferno of exploitation of the typical American factory worker at the turn of the 20th century. However, readers were more concerned with the health violations and unsanitary practices with which the meat was produced, and didn't seem to care all too much about the plight of the factory worker. Sinclair, when speaking about his rise to popularity, wrote that it occurred, quote, not because the public cared anything about the workers, but simply because the public did not want to eat tubercular beef. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered an investigation into a number of meatpacking industries, to which the owners of these facilities responded by having their workers thoroughly clean the factories prior to inspection. Despite this, Neal and Reynolds, who were leading the inspection, were still revolted by the conditions. The Bureau of Animal Industry responded by calling the claims intentionally misleading and false, a willful and deliberate misrepresentation of fact, and utter absurdity. The novel and consequent investigation into these factories eventually spawned the creations of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in 1906. Responding to the public reaction, Sinclair said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Rastafarianism is a religious and social movement born in Jamaica and has since spread around the world. It is considered to be an offshoot of Abrahamic religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Followers of the religion abide by dietary restrictions outlined in the Book of Leviticus, at minimum avoiding crustaceans and pork. However, many Rastas are also entirely vegetarian or plant-based, and much of their cuisine has Indian influences. Rastas follow a dietary custom called ital, which avoids eating all meat. Ital also encourages eating natural foods, preferably grown in one's own garden. Donald Watson was an English animal rights advocate who founded the Vegan Society. He developed a concern for animal rights at a young age, having turned vegetarian at 14 years old after witnessing the slaughter of a pig on his uncle's farm, and eventually went vegan 4 years later at the age of 18. In 1944, he coined the word vegan as a means of separating vegetarians from people who omitted all animal products. And in the same year, he founded the Vegan Society, which is still active to this day. The Vegan Society has developed their own definition of veganism, which is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude as far as is possible and practicable all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. In his 90s, he claimed he was still able to climb mountains, and he also sought to outlive his critics to prove that veganism is neither unhealthy nor unsustainable. Angela Davis is a renowned scholar, professor, author, and civil rights activist who fights for multiple issues, including women's rights and economic justice. However, many don't know that she is also vegan. Davis recognized the link between the oppression of animals and humans and went vegan as a means of supporting animal rights and challenging the system of production. At the 27th Empowering Women of Color Conference, Davis said the world must challenge the whole capitalist industrial form of food production, stating, "Most people don't think about the horrendous suffering that those animals must endure simply to become food products to be consumed by human beings." Alice Walker is an American novelist, short story writer, poet, and social activist. She won the National Book Award for hardcover fiction and the Pulitzer Prize for fiction after writing her 1982 novel, The Color Purple. The novel focuses on the life of African American women in the United States in the 1930s, addressing numerous issues including their exceedingly low position in American social culture. When speaking about veganism, she said, "If I'm eating food I know was a creature in a cage, it brings up memories of segregation and the stories from my ancestors of being in captivity and denied their personalities, their true beings." Animals are not made for us or our use. They have their own use, which is just being who they are. Dexter Scott King is an American civil rights activist and the second son of civil rights leaders Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Dexter has been a dedicated vegan and animal rights activist since the late 1980s. Civil rights activist Coretta Scott King has been a tireless advocate for a variety of causes, including the rights of people of color, women, the LGBT community, and, unbeknownst to many, animals. Her son Dexter was vegan and convinced his mother to adopt the lifestyle in the last decade of her life. She said she believed veganism was the next logical extension of Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolence. Animal Liberation is a book published in 1975 by Australian philosopher Peter Singer. Many within the animal liberation movement consider it to be foundational in popularizing the contemporary discussion of animal rights within philosophy. Singer argued, from a utilitarian perspective as he rejected a rights-based approach, that the interests of animals should be considered because of their ability to experience suffering, and that the idea of rights was not necessary in order to consider them. He popularized the term speciesism in his book, which had been coined by Richard Ryder to describe the exploitative treatment of animals. Singer draws a lot of inspiration from Jeremy Bentham in the formation of his arguments and ideas. Singer argues that the interests of all beings capable of suffering should be given equal consideration, writing, "The basic principle of equality does not require equal or identical treatment. It requires equal consideration. Equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatments and different rights." Although the book was successful, Singer was disappointed in the lack of impact it had, saying it's had effects around the margins, of course, but they have mostly been minor. When I wrote it, I really thought the book would change the world. I know it sounds a little grand now, but at the time, the 60s still existed for us. It looked as if real changes were possible, and I let myself believe that this would be one of them. All you have to do is walk around the corner to McDonald's to see how successful I have been. Veganism in the late 2010s and early 2020s boasts more popularity than it did at perhaps any other point in history. Much of the movement today is driven by large social media personalities, such as Ed Winters, Earthling Ed, Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, and many others. The annual Animal Rights March gains more and more participants each year. There are entire festivals dedicated towards celebrating veganism, and influential celebrities are embracing the movement, with some of them actively promoting animal rights on their platforms. You can look almost anywhere and see efforts made by vegans to have their voices heard and their movement recognized. Whether they be black vegans dismantling the association people have of animal rights with white vegan companies successfully getting their products to go mainstream, or the abundance of farmed animal sanctuaries helping to make the world better for those rescued from unimaginably horrific conditions. However you look at it, veganism is deeply rooted in human history, and it will continue to influence and guide us as the years go on.